Hello and welcome back to the Morbid Moonlight 31 Days of Halloween, where every day this month we're going to be taking a look at a new horror film starring the one and only Felissa Rose. And today, it's time to take a look at 2015's Zombie Killers Elephant's Graveyard, or just straight up Zombie Killers for short. I gather the only reason that the movie wasn't just simply called Zombie Killers was because that title was actually taken already, so what we've ended up with instead is this clunky little mouthful of a name. Now, we might as well get this out of the way right now. I'm just not really the biggest fan of zombie films in general at all, and that might seem like a bit of a problem. In actual fact, I had planned to skip this film entirely just because the genre, especially in the 21st century incarnation of that genre, just kind of leaves me a bit cold. I mean, I like the kind of early 80s Italian zombie films, but the kind of cheaper, drabber, modern-day American version of the kind of Walking Dead onwards era, I find this really doesn't offer anything up at all to me in terms of what I'm actually looking for a horror film. And most kind of zombie films just tend to be these really kind of cynical, militaristic misery fests filled with kind of nihilistic violence and just these posturing, macho, cliched characters where, you know, morality is punished and any kind of redeeming humanity is just sneered at and made to suffer. They're sort of films that appeal to kind of insular, cynical teenagers generally. But the only reason that I decided to actually give Zombie Killers a watch is because it's written and directed by my man B. Harrison Smith, the director of Camp Dread. And given how much I actually enjoyed that film, I thought that I'd give him the benefit of the doubt and check out this, which is his second film as director. Suffice it to say though, that I've got a few problems with Zombie Killers in general, several of which sadly do come down to the fact that I just don't really like the genre as a whole. I would, however, go as far as to say that I'd consider myself to be a real fan of Harrison Smith's work, in that I really like his approach to what he does, and though I can see that at this stage in his career, he's still kind of working within certain limitations, there's definitely this passion and understanding for what he does that really shines through. Maybe it's just that a lot of those early 2000s low-budget films of the sort that Felissa Rose was appearing in really just haven't aged that well and tend to be quite ugly to look at. But I'm glad to finally see Felissa Rose now appearing in films that actually look decent and are made by people who want to do more than just cobble together whatever they can, although not that there's fundamentally anything wrong with that. Like a lot of directors, B. Harrison Smith makes use of a lot of the same actors in this as he did for Camp Dread, which is always a cool thing to do because it suggests this kind of bond of trust and respect between actors and director. The plot of Zombie Killers, I should say, is pretty standard stuff about this kind of isolated community living in a simple post-apocalyptic rural lifestyle, and we follow the lives of various characters as they come to terms with what their world has become. There's a group of youngsters, played by pretty much all of the campers in Camp Dread, who call themselves the Zombie Killers, and have formed this kind of Megaforce type ragtag military unit to protect their community from the zombie hordes, led by none other than the movie's big name star, Mr. Billy Zane. Conflict within the community constantly kind of simmers away as the zombie-killing group investigate, before finally coming to uncover some terrifying truth about the zombie outbreak itself, which, I've got to say, is actually quite interesting, and it shares some kind of common ground with one of my personal favourite zombie films, which is The Living Dead at the Manchester Morgue, or Let Sleeping Corpses Lie, as it's also known. There's a lot of lessons learned from Camp Dread here, not least of which is the ability to weave kind of various character threads into this interesting tapestry whilst making sure that each character stands out in their own right, even the ones that are given not much in the way of screen time. The fact that a lot of the cast carry over from Harrison Smith's previous film is a double-edged sword. It's great as a viewer to see familiar faces because it allows us to identify with characters quicker than having to get to know a brand new group of faces, and it's also good that Harrison Smith rewards people that he obviously gets on with. The flip side though is that the last time we saw a lot of these actors, they were playing young, dumb campers, which they did convincingly, but a lot of them seem a lot less convincing as military types given how young they are, although they are meant to be a gang of kind of youthful go-getter types. In terms of other cast members, there's three what I consider well-known names here. Billy Zane, of course, is the main star, and I've got to be honest in saying that I'm not a huge fan of his work, and I don't think he's nearly half as good in this as Eric Roberts was in Camp Dread, as the big-budget star, although this is definitely a trickier part. There's stars that come to lower-budget films and bring gravitas and class to what they do, and then there's stars that you see in low-budget films and you wonder what the fuck they agreed to do this kind of a film for, and I've got to say that I think Billy Zane is on the latter end of the scale. Also pretty underused, we've got Dee Wallace playing one of the character's terminally ill mothers, and although she gets a few kind of emotional scenes to pull off, most of which avoid being mawkish, I just think that she's not really able to elevate things especially. See, there's an art to getting the right established actor along for a smaller role to know exactly how to get the most from them, so you don't end up looking like you've just gone for a bit of cheap stunt casting. Both Eric Roberts and Felissa Rose really killed it with Camp Dread, but I don't think that either Billy Zane or Dee Wallace are worth their weight here. But that could be down to the fact that they're playing archetypes instead of characters that are allowed to have much depth. We also need to talk about the legend herself, Felissa Rose, because, well, the good news is that she's playing a great, intriguing part, looking maybe the sexiest that she's ever looked in any of her films, and I think that she gives a fantastic performance. The bad news is that she's on screen for about 4 minutes, and she feels like one of the characters that kind of gets lost in the shuffle of a pretty bulky ensemble cast. But in general, I think that a lot of my problems really do come down to the genre as a whole, though. That might sound pretty blinkered, but hear me out on this, okay? Because there's a reason a lot of low-budget filmmakers try their hands at slasher films, and that's because they're very easy to make and rely largely upon very familiar settings, character archetypes, and pretty everyday scenarios that your audience can relate to. They're cheap, they're easy to make, but they're also good entry-level films because they don't require a lot of expensive set dressing and world building like you get with period pieces, or sci-fi, or westerns, or action films. They're very good things to do on a budget because pretty much all your audience expects are gore effects. Whereas, doing a zombie film on a budget can be difficult because you need to take the time to set up your world and convince your audience that what they're seeing on screen is actually an apocalyptic landscape. You also need every single actor on screen to convince you that they're not just cheap nobodies from LA, but people that have been through a lot and are living in a nightmarish future. You need to put the effort into getting the sets, the props, the makeups, then you need to make sure people interact convincingly with one another, all whilst trying to avoid doing just the same cliched stuff as every other zombie film. Now that might not be too much of a challenge if you're Zack Snyder with a Netflix budget of a fuck ton of dollars, but on a tight budget like Zombie Killers clearly has got, the whole zombie world can be quite difficult to pull off convincingly. One of the tricks used to make things seem more realistic is that our characters here are cine literate, and they're all coming out with film quotes as well as referring to the whole situation as being like something from a zombie film. Now, I tend to hate all that shit, but I think that it comes across okay here, just because in general the tone of the film is a lot more serious, rather than being this kind of overly ironic, self-mocking thing. More than anything though, I think that what it all comes down to is the fact that there's only a few modes that the zombie film can really accommodate, and the one that Zombie Killers goes for is out and out misery, where everything's really downbeat and all the characters are pretty depressed, which to be fair you would be, but it does tend to make for very one-note drama. Even though I like most of the actors here, I think that the kind of isn't everything just terrible acting and low budget stuff tends to come on as looking a little bit school playish, because I think that melodrama of any kind brings out the worst in bad actors. We're playing lovable goofs with undercurrents of something more interesting like the same actors did in Camp Dread. I think I can buy that a lot easier. I know it might sound a little bit condescending, but I think that the audience for low-budget films expect a certain lightness of touch, because if you're ultra dark and serious, then it becomes harder to take the whole milieu totally seriously. There's definitely a few kind of slightly weepy soap opera moments that do nobody any favours, as well as a few tough guy moments for our young zombie killers that are definitely less than convincing. Although in general, the standard of acting is better than most films in its weight category. I know this sounds a bit harsh, but I think that whilst Camp Dread was a film made with an awareness of its own budgetary restrictions, Zombie Killers is a lot more ambitious, and there's some stuff that does end up falling short, including some less than convincing CGI. Although it is used fairly sparsely, and for what I'd consider pretty interesting ideas, which mean that even though the visuals are pretty scrappy, I can appreciate that the idea of a stampeding herd of zombie deer is cool, even if it doesn't necessarily look the most convincing. See, the thing is, if you're clever, your audience should never realise a film's limitations. Often the only way you'll be made aware of things like that are when a film fails. If this film hadn't tried CGI deer, then you wouldn't know that it doesn't have the budget to pull that sort of thing off. Although I can respect it for trying, it does just end up looking a little bit cheap, which is a shame, because there's other stuff in it that it really does well with. Slightly more of a problem, though, is the ending. And it's got one of those ends that's less cleverly open-ended than something that seems designed as sequel bait, although pretty much all of the plot threads are actually tied up. To the best of my knowledge, a sequel to this film never materialised, which means that we would never see more of these characters. Does that ending drag things down? Maybe a little bit, but it also closes things off first, so it's not like it's a film that never has a proper ending, it just ends, and then it takes a few minutes to rev up its own never-to-be-made sequel. I admit I've no idea whether Harrison Smith ever wanted to make a sequel or not. I'm guessing he probably did, and then maybe this film didn't do so well, so he abandoned that idea and moved on to something else. So, all things said, I think that for a type of film that I'm not that keen on, from a director who I'm growing to love more and more, Zombie Killers is a lot better than I'd expected. In terms of the Felissa factor, this one is little more than an extended cameo, although it is an intriguing part. Honestly, I'd probably say maybe a Felissa factor of 2 out of 10, and I think that the film suffers for ignoring her character and focusing on more archetypal, and I'd say less interesting characters. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that she had a more substantial plotline that had to be cut out for timing reasons just because of the overall ensemble approach to the characters interweaving plotlines, and the fact that Zombie Killers runs at about 105 minutes, which is maybe about 10 minutes too long to be honest, although I don't think it's a dull 105 minutes by any means, and it does use its runtime to flesh things out pretty well. But as a film overall, I think that Zombie Killers Elephant's Graveyard deserves probably about a 5.5 for me, or maybe just a 6. I've never been keen on ultra-nihilistic zombie films about humanity being driven to dark, miserable places, just because I think that kind of storytelling is so easy to do. It's so easy to skew dark and downbeat, whereas making something that's convincingly fun and upbeat like Camp Dread takes a lot more effort. It's a little bit too ambitious for its budget, to be honest, but it also wrings some legit emotions out of its characters, and the characterizations on the whole, I think, are really good. The score, once again by the amazing JOHN AVARESE, is first class and once again is available on Bandcamp if you want to check that out. But that said, I think that should wrap things up for day number 8 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. Thanks a lot for watching, hope you enjoyed it. Please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already, that would be a great help. And I'll see you back here tomorrow with day number 9 of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose, and I hope that we'll see you there.